It was a chilly autumn evening in Cedar Ridge, a small suburban town where nothing much ever happened. The streets were quiet, lined with rows of neatly trimmed lawns and cozy homes glowing softly under the orange streetlights. Officer Mark Reynolds sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. He had been on duty for 6 hours already, and so far it had been an uneventful shift, just the way he liked it. Mark wasn't new to this job. At 38 years old, he had spent over half his life serving as a police officer in Cedar Ridge. Over the years, he had earned a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who followed the rules without fail. His colleagues respected him, and the townspeople generally trusted him. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the eerie stillness in the air, or the faint chill that seemed to creep into the car no matter how high he turned up the heater. Whatever it was, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be anything but ordinary. As he drove down Elm Street, his headlights caught sight of a black sedan speeding slightly above the posted limit. The car zipped past him, its tires humming against the asphalt. Mark frowned. Speeding violations weren't uncommon, especially this late at night when people thought they could get away with breaking the rules. Still, he couldn't ignore it, not if he wanted to keep his record clean. Flicking on his sirens, Mark pulled out into the lane behind the sedan and signaled for it to stop. The driver complied almost immediately, pulling over to the side of the road. Mark parked his cruiser a few feet behind the car and grabbed his flashlight before stepping out into the crisp night air. The man who emerged from the sedan was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit that looked expensive enough to belong in a boardroom rather than a sleepy suburb. His skin was dark, his features striking, and his movements deliberate yet calm. As soon as he stepped out of the vehicle, he placed both hands on top of the car, clearly aware of protocol during traffic stops. Mark approached cautiously, his hand resting near the grip of his holstered gun. "License and registration," he said firmly, shining his flashlight onto the man's face. The man didn't flinch. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and retrieved his wallet, pulling out the requested documents. "Here you go, officer," he said, his voice smooth and steady. Mark took the papers and glanced at them under the light. The name on the ID read Marcus Johnson. There was something about the name, or maybe the man himself, that made Mark pause. It wasn't just the polished appearance or the confident demeanor. It was something deeper, something Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. "You were going 5 miles over the speed limit," Mark stated, trying to sound authoritative. Marcus nodded. "I apologize for that, officer. I'm running late for an important meeting." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Important meeting?" he repeated skeptically. "In Cedar Ridge?" Marcus smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Not everyone has the luxury of staying within one place, officer. Some of us have responsibilities elsewhere." The comment irked Mark. Who did this guy think he was? Just because he wore a fancy suit and talked like he owned the world didn't mean he was above the law. Determined to assert control, Mark decided to run a background check on Marcus. He radioed dispatch requesting information on the name and license plate number. While waiting for the response, Mark studied Marcus closely. The man stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't seem nervous or defensive, which struck Mark as odd. Most people who got pulled over, even those who hadn't done anything wrong, tended to show some level of anxiety. Not Marcus. If anything, he looked bored. Finally, the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Officer Reynolds, we have a hit on that name. Stand by." Mark waited, his curiosity growing with each passing second. When the dispatcher spoke again, her tone was unusually serious. "Marcus Johnson is flagged under federal jurisdiction. Repeat, do not engage further without clearance." Mark froze. Federal jurisdiction, what did that even mean? He stared at Marcus, whose expression hadn't changed. Was this guy really involved with the feds? Or was this some kind of mistake? "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through Mark's thoughts. Mark hesitated. Something about this situation felt off. Normally, he would have let the driver go after issuing a warning or writing a ticket, But now, with this new information, he wasn't sure what to do. "What agency are you with?" Mark demanded, his voice sharper than intended. Marcus tilted, his head slightly studying Mark as if weighing his options. Then, without saying a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed a shiny badge and an official ID card identifying him as Special Agent Marcus Johnson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Mark's stomach dropped. An FBI agent. He had just pulled over an FBI agent and, not just any agent, someone who clearly carried weight and authority. "Well, officer," Marcus said, closing the wallet and slipping it back into his pocket. "Are we done here, or do you plan to arrest me for speeding?" His tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that made Mark uneasy. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of his depth. Officer Mark Reynolds stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. An FBI agent. He had pulled over an actual FBI agent, a man who likely dealt with crimes far more serious than a minor speeding violation. The weight of his actions hit him like a freight train, and for a moment all he could do was stare at Marcus Johnson's badge, still visible in his hand. "Are you going to answer my question, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, breaking the silence. His voice carried no trace of anger or hostility, but there was a subtle challenge in it, a dare for Mark to admit he had made a mistake. Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. I didn't know," he stammered, feeling the heat rise to his cheeks. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know what? That I'm a federal agent? Or that pulling me over might not be the best idea you've ever had?" The comment stung, but Mark couldn't deny its truth. He had acted impulsively, jumping straight into action without considering the bigger picture. Now he was paying the price for it. "I was just doing my job," Mark said defensively, though even to his own ears the excuse sounded weak. Marcus nodded slowly as if weighing Mark's words. "Doing your job is one thing, Officer Reynolds, but targeting someone based on assumptions is another." Mark blinked. "What are you talking about? I wasn't targeting anyone." "Weren't you?" Marcus countered, his tone sharper now. "Tell me, how many white drivers get pulled over in this town for going 5 miles over the speed limit?" The question caught Mark off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. Was Marcus accusing him of racial profiling? It couldn't be true. Could it? "I don't make decisions based on race," Mark insisted, though doubt began creeping into his mind. Marcus studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Maybe not consciously, but sometimes biases sneak in when we least expect them. And trust me, I've seen enough cops like you to recognize that." Signs. Mark felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. Who was this guy to judge him? Sure, Marcus was an FBI agent, but that didn't give him the right to question Mark's integrity. "You don't know me," Mark snapped, his voice rising slightly. "You have no idea how I operate." "No, I don't," Marcus agreed, unfazed by Mark's outburst. "But I do know this. You stopped me because of how I look. Admit it." The accusation hung heavy in the air between them. Mark wanted to deny it, to argue that Marcus was wrong, but deep down he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the other man was right. Before Mark could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Look, I don't have time for this," Marcus said, slipping the phone back into his jacket. "You can either write me a ticket, which I'll contest, or let me go. Your choice." Mark hesitated. Writing a ticket would mean officially documenting the incident, which could lead to trouble later. On the other hand, letting Marcus go felt like admitting defeat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark handed the license and registration back to Marcus. "Just be careful on the road," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Marcus accepted the documents with a nod. "Appreciate it, officer. Have a good night." With that, he slid back into his sedan and drove off, leaving Mark standing alone under the streetlight. Back at the station, by the time Mark returned to the station, word of the incident had already spread. Dispatchers and fellow officers whispered among themselves. their eyes darting toward him whenever he passed. Some offered sympathetic nods, while others exchanged knowing looks. Mark ignored them all, retreating to his desk to finish up paperwork. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his thoughts kept returning to Marcus Johnson. The man's words echoed in his mind, gnawing at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. Had he really targeted Marcus because of his race? Or was it just a coincidence? Mark replayed the events of the night in his head, searching for answers. He remembered noticing the black sedan speeding past him, its sleek design catching his attention. At the time, he hadn't thought twice about it. It was just another car violating traffic laws. But then again, how often did he pull over white drivers for similar infractions? The truth was, he couldn't recall a single instance. Most of the tickets he issued went to people of color, particularly African Americans. Was that because they committed more violations or because he unconsciously singled them out? The questions weighed heavily on Mark, making it impossible to concentrate on his work. By the end of his shift, he was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Kent Internal Affairs gets involved. 2 days later, Mark received a summons to appear before Internal Affairs. Apparently, Marcus had filed a formal complaint about the traffic stop, alleging racial profiling. The news sent shockwaves through the department, dividing opinions among his colleagues. Some officers rallied behind Mark, insisting that he was being unfairly targeted. "He's just doing his job," one of them argued during lunch break. "If we start second-guessing every decision we make, we might as well quit." Others weren't so supportive. "Maybe Marcus has a point," another officer said quietly. "We need to hold ourselves accountable if we want people to trust us." Caught in the middle of the debate, Mark felt increasingly isolated. For years, he had prided himself on being a fair and impartial officer. Now, his reputation was on the line, and he wasn't sure how to defend himself. When the day of the hearing arrived, Mark walked into the conference room with a mix of dread and determination. Sitting across from him were 2 representatives from Internal Affairs, their expressions unreadable. "Officer Reynolds," one of them began, "we're here to discuss the incident involving Special Agent Marcus Johnson. Can you tell us your side of the story?" Mark took a deep breath and launched into an explanation, recounting everything that had happened that night. He admitted to stopping Marcus for speeding, but denied any allegations of bias. "We'll review the evidence and reach a conclusion shortly," the investigator said once Mark had finished speaking. As Mark left the room, he couldn't help but wonder, would they believe him? Or would this incident tarnish his career forever? A lingering feeling days turned into weeks, and Mark heard nothing from Internal Affairs. In the meantime, life at the station returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. Fellow officers stopped whispering about him, and the incident faded into the background. But for Mark, it remained front and center. He found himself questioning every decision he made, analyzing each interaction for signs of bias. The confidence he once had in his abilities began to erode, replaced by doubt and uncertainty. Then, late one evening, as he sat alone in his patrol car, his radio crackled to life. "Officer Reynolds, report to the local FBI field office immediately." Mark's heart sank. Whatever awaited him there, he knew it wouldn't be good. Still, he started the engine and headed toward the address, steeling himself for whatever came next. Little did he know, this meeting would change everything, not just for him, but for the way he viewed the world. The drive to the FBI field office felt like the longest of Mark Reynolds' life. Each mile seemed to stretch endlessly, giving him too much time to think and overthink. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anger, guilt, and even a sliver of curiosity about what awaited him. Would Marcus Johnson demand an apology, file additional complaints, or worse, push for disciplinary action that could end Mark's career? When he finally arrived, the building loomed before him, a stark, imposing structure with large glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. It looked nothing like the modest police station where Mark worked every day. This was a place of power, authority, and secrets, things Mark had always respected from afar but never fully understood. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his patrol car and walked up to the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was calm yet intimidating. Agents moved briskly through the lobby, their faces focused and unreadable. A receptionist greeted Mark politely and directed him to a waiting area. After a few minutes, a tall man in a dark suit appeared. "Officer Reynolds?" the man asked, extending a hand. "I'm Agent Thompson. Special Agent Johnson is expecting you." Mark shook the man's hand, noting how firm and confident the grip was. "Thank you," he replied, trying to sound composed despite the knot forming in his stomach. Agent Thompson led him down a series of hallways lined with closed doors, each marked with numbers and codes. They eventually stopped outside one labeled Conference Room B. Knocking lightly, Thompson opened the door and gestured for Mark to enter. Sitting at the head of a sleek wooden table was Marcus Johnson. He looked exactly as Mark remembered him, calm, collected, and radiating quiet authority. There were no signs of hostility or resentment in his expression. If anything, he seemed almost curious. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, standing to greet him. "Thanks for coming." Mark nodded stiffly, unsure of what to say. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," Marcus replied, motioning for Mark to take a seat. "Please, sit down. We need to talk." The conversation begins. Once they were both seated, Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Mark intently. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken tension and unanswered questions. Finally, Marcus broke it. "I imagine you're wondering why I called you here," he began, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. "To be honest, yes," Mark admitted, gripping the edge of the table tightly. "I figured this was about the complaint." Marcus nodded. "It is, in part, but not entirely. Let me start by saying something important. I don't hate you, Officer Reynolds. In fact, I think you're a decent guy who got caught up in a situation he didn't fully understand." Mark blinked, surprised by the unexpected kindness in Marcus's words. "Then why am I here?" "Because I want to help you," Marcus said simply. "Help me?" Mark echoed, confused. "How?" Marcus sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Let me tell you a story. When I first joined the FBI, I was young and eager, just like you probably were when you became a cop. One of my earliest assignments involved working undercover in a predominantly white neighborhood. I posed as a maintenance worker, blending in while gathering intel on a suspected drug ring. One day I was walking back to my car when a local officer pulled me aside. He accused me of breaking into houses because, according to him, people like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this. Mark winced, already knowing where the story was headed. At first I was furious, Marcus continued. I wanted to report him, to make sure he faced consequences for treating me like a criminal. But then I realized something. He wasn't acting out of malice. He was scared. Scared of change, of difference, of things he didn't understand. And that fear clouded his judgment. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Are you saying I'm like that officer? No, Marcus said quickly. Not exactly. You're not malicious, Officer Reynolds, but you are human, and humans have biases, conscious or unconscious, that influence their decisions. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Facing hard truths, Mark stared at Marcus, his chest tightening. Everything the agent had said resonated deeply, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Hadn't he always prided himself on being fair and impartial? Yet here he was, sitting across from someone pointing out flaws he hadn't even realized existed. I don't know, Mark admitted quietly. What am I supposed to do? Marcus smiled faintly. Start by acknowledging the problem. Pretending it doesn't exist won't make it go away. Trust me, I've seen plenty of officers dig themselves deeper holes by refusing to admit they made mistakes. But admitting it feels like failing, Mark countered, his voice tinged with frustration. It's not failure, Marcus assured him. It's growth. Growth is messy, painful, and sometimes embarrassing. But it's also necessary if you want to be better, not just as a cop, but as a person. Mark nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this incident didn't have to define him. Maybe it could be an opportunity to learn and improve. So, what happens now? Mark asked cautiously. That depends on you, Marcus replied. If you're willing to reflect on your actions and make changes, I'll withdraw the complaint. Consider it a second chance. But if you ignore the lessons here, we'll likely cross paths again, and next time I won't be so lenient. The ultimatum hung in the air, clear and undeniable. Mark knew he couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. I'll try, he said earnestly. I can't promise I'll get everything right, but I'll try. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's all anyone can ask for. Now let's talk about some practical steps you can take moving forward. Learning from experience over. The next hour, Marcus shared insights from his own experiences, offering tips on how to recognize and address implicit biases. He encouraged Mark to seek training programs focused on diversity and inclusion, suggesting that exposure to different perspectives could broaden his understanding. You might also consider mentoring younger officers, Marcus added. Sharing. Your journey with them could inspire them to approach their work with more empathy and awareness. Mark listened attentively, taking mental notes of everything Marcus said. By the end of the conversation, he felt equipped, not just to handle future situations better, but to rebuild trust within his community. As they wrapped up, Marcus stood and extended his hand. Good luck, Officer Reynolds. Remember, change starts with honesty. Be honest with yourself and you'll find the strength to grow. Mark shook his hand firmly, gratitude swelling in his chest. Thank you, Agent Johnson, for everything. With that, Marcus left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. The drive back to the police station after his meeting with Marcus Johnson was unlike any other Mark Reynolds had experienced. The weight of the conversation still lingered in his mind, but instead of dread or shame, he felt a strange sense of determination. For so long, Mark had prided himself on being a good cop, a man who followed the rules and served his community faithfully. But now, he realized that being good wasn't enough. If he truly wanted to make a difference, he needed to dig deeper, challenge his assumptions, and strive to be better, not just for himself, but for the people he swore to protect. As he parked his patrol car outside the station, Mark took a moment to sit quietly and gather his thoughts. He thought about Marcus's words, especially the part about acknowledging biases and using them as stepping stones for growth. It wasn't easy to admit that he might have let personal prejudices influence his actions, but it was necessary if he wanted to move forward. Stepping out of the car, Mark noticed the familiar faces of his colleagues through the station windows. Some were chatting casually, others hunched over desks filling out paperwork. Everything seemed normal, yet Mark couldn't help feeling like an outsider looking in. These were the same people he'd worked alongside for years, but now he saw them, and himself, through a different lens. How many times had they all made snap judgments based on appearances? How many lives had been impacted by those decisions, whether intentionally or not? Mark walked inside, greeted by nods and murmurs from his coworkers. No one mentioned the incident with Marcus anymore. It had become old news, buried under the daily grind of calls and reports. But Mark knew it wasn't something he could simply forget. He owed it to himself, and to everyone he served, to take action. Seeking guidance. Over the next few days, Mark threw himself into learning. He started by enrolling in a training program recommended by Marcus, one focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The sessions were eye-opening, challenging everything Mark thought he knew about fairness and justice. Through role-playing exercises, case studies, and candid discussions, he began to see how systemic issues affected policing practices and community relations. One particular exercise stood out to him. Participants were divided into groups and given scenarios involving interactions between officers and civilians of various backgrounds. In one scenario, Mark played the role of a young black teenager pulled over for a minor traffic violation. As he acted out the scene, he felt the tension and fear that came with being on the receiving end of authority. When the officer raised their voice and demanded answers, Mark instinctively flinched, realizing how intimidating such behavior could feel. Afterward, the facilitator asked the group to reflect on the experience. Mark spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "I never really thought about what it's like to be on the other side," he admitted. "To feel powerless, judged before you even open your mouth. I didn't mean to make anyone feel that way, but maybe I did." His honesty earned nods of approval from the other participants. One woman, a veteran officer named Lisa, leaned forward and said, "We've all been there, Mark. None of us are perfect. What matters is that we're willing to listen and learn." Her words struck a chord with Mark. For the first time, he felt less alone in his struggles. Maybe change wasn't just possible, it was achievable, especially when approached collectively. Rebuilding trust, armed with new insights, Mark decided to put his lessons into practice. His first step was reaching out to local community leaders, particularly those representing marginalized groups. He attended town hall meetings, listened to concerns, and apologized sincerely for past mistakes. At first, some residents were skeptical, questioning whether his efforts were genuine or just a PR stunt, but Mark stayed patient, showing up consistently and proving that he was serious about fostering trust. One evening, while attending a neighborhood watch meeting, Mark met a woman named Angela Davis. She was a longtime resident of Cedar Ridge and a vocal advocate for racial equality. Initially, Angela was wary of Mark, having heard stories of unfair treatment from law enforcement. But as she watched him engage respectfully with attendees and answer tough questions honestly, her skepticism softened. "You're not like the rest of them," Angela remarked during a break in the meeting. "I'm trying not to be," Mark replied humbly. "It's going to take time, though. I can't undo years of mistrust overnight." Angela nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. Just keep doing what you're doing, and maybe we'll start seeing real progress around here." Her words gave Mark renewed motivation. Building bridges wouldn't happen quickly, but every small effort counted. Facing resistance. Not everyone welcomed Mark's transformation with open arms. Back at the station, some of his colleagues viewed his newfound focus on inclusivity as unnecessary or even divisive. "Why are you wasting your time with this stuff?" grumbled Officer Harris, a gruff veteran with little patience for political correctness. "We've got real crimes to solve, not seminars to attend," Mark clenched his jaw but kept his composure. "It's not a waste of time, Harris. If we want people to trust us, we need to understand where they're coming from. That starts with listening." Harris rolled his eyes. "Suit yourself, Reynolds, but don't expect me to join your little feel-good club." Despite the pushback, Mark remained undeterred. He understood that change often faced resistance, especially in environments resistant to disruption. Instead of arguing, he focused on leading by example, hoping that his actions would eventually inspire others to follow suit. A turning point, one night, while patrolling a predominantly black neighborhood, Mark encountered a situation that tested his resolve. He spotted a young man walking briskly down the street, his hoodie pulled low over his face. Instinctively, Mark slowed his cruiser and observed. In the past, he might have stopped the individual immediately, assuming suspicious behavior. But this time, he paused, reminding himself of everything he'd learned. Could there be another explanation? Was he jumping to conclusions again? Deciding to approach cautiously, Mark rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, everything okay?" The young man turned, startled but cooperative. "Yeah, officer, just heading home." Mark smiled warmly. "All right, stay safe out here." As he drove away, he realized something profound. Giving someone the benefit of the doubt didn't weaken his authority. It strengthened it. By choosing empathy over assumption, he had taken a step toward rebuilding trust, one interaction at a time. Reflections. By the end of the month, Mark noticed subtle shifts, not just within himself, but in the way others responded to him. Residents who once avoided making eye contact now greeted him with smiles. Fellow officers, though slow to embrace change, began asking questions about the training programs he attended. Even Angela Davis invited him to speak at a youth mentorship event, praising his commitment to improvement. Mark knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years he felt proud of the path he was on. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And as he sat in his patrol car one quiet evening, reflecting on how far he'd come, he silently thanked Marcus Johnson for setting him on this journey. Little did he know their paths were destined to cross again, one final time. Months had passed since Mark Reynolds' transformative meeting with Marcus Johnson. The lessons he'd learned that day had become the foundation of his new approach to policing, one rooted in empathy, accountability, and a genuine desire to connect with the community. Slowly but surely his efforts began paying off. Residents who once distrusted officers now greeted him warmly on neighborhood patrols. Colleagues who initially dismissed his focus on inclusivity started asking questions, some even joining training sessions themselves. But despite the progress, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He hadn't heard from Marcus since their conversation at the FBI field office. While he understood that Marcus likely had bigger responsibilities than keeping tabs on a small-town cop, Mark couldn't help wondering if he'd truly made the impact Marcus hoped for. Had he lived up to the second chance Marcus gave him? One crisp autumn morning as Mark prepared to start his shift, his radio crackled to life. "Officer Reynolds, report to downtown Cedar Ridge immediately. There's a situation requiring your attention." Mark frowned. Downtown wasn't typically part of his patrol route, and the urgency in dispatch's tone suggested this wasn't a routine call. Grabbing his gear, he hopped into his cruiser and sped toward the location. An unexpected encounter. When Mark arrived, he found a crowd gathered outside City Hall. At first glance, it looked like a protest, people holding signs and chanting, slogans about racial justice and police reform. But amidst the chaos stood someone familiar: Marcus Johnson. Dressed in his usual sharp suit, Marcus appeared calm and composed, speaking to reporters and organizers alike. Mark hesitated, unsure whether to approach or stay back. Before he could decide, Marcus spotted him and waved him over. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said with a smile as Mark approached. "Good to see you again." "Agent Johnson," Mark replied, still surprised to find him there. "What's going on?" "This is a rally organized by local activists," Marcus explained. "They're advocating for systemic changes in law enforcement practices, things like better training, increased accountability, and stronger community partnerships." Mark nodded thoughtfully. These were topics he'd grown passionate about over the past few months. "It sounds important." "It is," Marcus agreed, "which is why I wanted you here. You've been making waves in your department, Mark. People are noticing the work you're doing and they want to hear your story." Mark blinked, taken aback. "My story? I'm just one officer trying to do better." "One officer can make a difference," Marcus countered. "Look around you. This movement doesn't happen without individuals willing to step up and lead by example. And that's exactly what you've done." The compliment caught Mark off guard. For so long, he'd doubted his ability to affect real change. Hearing Marcus acknowledge his efforts filled him with pride and a renewed sense of purpose. Sharing his journey, later that afternoon, Marcus invited Mark to speak at the rally. Standing behind a makeshift podium, Mark looked out at the sea of faces before him. Some were skeptical, others curious, but all were listening intently. Taking a deep breath, he began to share his journey, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned, and the steps he'd taken to grow. "I won't stand here and pretend I have all the answers," Mark admitted, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "I've made plenty of mistakes, and I'll probably make more in the future. But what I've realized is that growth starts with honesty. It starts with admitting when we're wrong and being brave enough to change." He went on to describe how his encounter with Marcus had opened his eyes to biases he hadn't even realized he carried. He talked about the training programs he attended, the conversations he had with community members, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. When I pulled Agent Johnson over that night, I acted out of assumptions rather than facts, Mark confessed. That moment taught me that fairness isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding people. It's about seeing them as human beings, not stereotypes. As he finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause. Mark felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the support surrounding him. For the first time, he truly believed that his actions mattered, that even small changes could ripple outward and inspire others to do the same. A final conversation. After the rally ended, Marcus approached Mark once more. "You did well today," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Better than I expected, honestly." Mark chuckled nervously. "I wasn't sure anyone would listen. To be honest, I didn't think I deserved their trust." "You earned it," Marcus replied firmly. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're willing to keep improving. That's what leadership looks like." The praise warmed Mark's heart, but he still had one lingering question. "Why did you bring me here today? Why go through all this trouble?" Marcus smiled knowingly. "Because you remind me of myself when I was younger. The drive to do right, even when it's hard. I saw potential in you that night, Mark. Potential to be more than just a cop. Potential to be a catalyst for change." Mark shook his head, humbled by the words. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." "You are," Marcus insisted. "And besides, you're not alone. Movements like this, they're built on the shoulders of people like you. Ordinary folks doing extraordinary things." Larshut looking ahead as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Mark found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. From the fateful traffic stop to the rally that brought him face to face with his own growth, each moment had shaped him into the person he was today. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. Whether it was Angela Davis and her tireless advocacy, Lisa and her unwavering support, or Marcus and his guiding wisdom, Mark had a network of allies cheering him on every step of the way. Standing beside Marcus as the crowd dispersed, Mark extended his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for everything." Marcus shook his hand firmly, his expression warm yet resolute. "No need to thank me, Mark. Just keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustling streets of Cedar Ridge. As Mark watched him leave, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the second chance he'd been given, but for the opportunity to pay it forward. From that day forward, Mark vowed to continue leading with compassion, humility, and courage. He may have started as an ordinary officer in a small town, but he was determined to leave behind a legacy of hope, healing, and unity.